It's Miss Terry, and today I'm here to talk about my April picks for students in grades 7 through 8. We'll talk about some fiction, and then we'll talk about some graphic novels, and then some nonfiction. This first story I'd like to share is called Indivisible, and this is about a boy named Mateo whose family lives in New York City. They own a bodega shop, and he is really into Broadway. He's hoping to go to a fine arts school after high school, and one day he comes home from school to discover that his undocumented parents have been picked up by ICE, and he's now on his own. He's trying to keep his family together. He has a younger sister named Sophie that is only 7, and he's trying to figure out how he's going to keep the store running while his parents are gone, how he's going to feed and clothe his sister, get her to school, how he's going to finish high school and continue to do well. And he's really afraid to tell anybody what has happened because he's afraid it'll make matters worse. Well, he ends up having a neighbor named Jorge who kind of steps up and says, hey, look, I can see what's happening here. Let's see if we can get you some help. But he still is really reluctant, Mateo is, to share any of this with his friends or the other adults in his life. And things really kind of start to fall apart until he realizes that maybe reaching out and letting people know what's happening might be what actually saves his family. So it's called Indivisible. Maybe He Just Likes You tells the story of a 7th grader named Mila who is having some troubles with a group of boys who all of a sudden decided that it's okay to touch her without her permission. She has this green sweater that is kind of fuzzy, and it started out with what seemed rather innocent. They asked for a hug because the sweater was so soft, but she really doesn't like where it's kind of continuing. They're starting to make comments, other touches are happening, and she doesn't really know how to deal with this. She's kind of told some of her friends, but they just kind of blow it off. Oh, they're just flirting. Oh, why are you overreacting? It's not that big of a deal. Maybe he just likes you. But she knows that what's happening is not all right. Unfortunately, she does reach out to an adult who doesn't really help her right away. But then she signs up for some karate classes, and it's through those classes that she's able to find that inner strength inside of her to step up and say, no, I don't want you to do this anymore. So it's called Maybe He Just Likes You. Clair tells the story of a very intrepid young lady named Drew who's really a true crime buff, and she has this true crime writer that she really idolizes, and she kind of starts to create these little profiles of all of her friends in the hopes of following in this woman's footsteps. And then one day her mom runs off with the guidance counselor, and she's just shocked. She's like, how could I not have seen the signs? Here I am, this great detective, looking for clues and mysteries all around me, and I didn't even see this happening in my own family. And so she decides to kind of retrace the steps to see where could I have gone wrong. Unfortunately, then a cyberbully announces it to the entire school that her mom has done this, and Drew is mortified, and she decides that she's going to try to track down who this anonymous cyberbully is and put a stop to it. And it's only when the bully attacks another student and she makes a friend that she realizes that she'll be able to figure this out. So that's Drew Clair gets a clue. There's also a little romance in that story as her best friend keeps trying to kiss her, and she's like, what are you doing? Stay away from me. This next one is a retelling of a familiar story. It's called Cinder and Glass, and it is a retelling of the Cinderella story. But in this story, Cinder actually falls in love with the prince's brother. Unfortunately, she knows that unless she wins the hand of the prince, she's not going to be able to escape the cruelty of her stepmother and stepsisters, and she has to really come to a decision. Do I follow my heart, or do I do what I know I need to do to survive? So it's called Cinder and Glass. When You Get the Chance is a story about a girl named Millie who also is very obsessed with Broadway. She lives with her single dad, and one day she comes across her dad's old journal and discovers that he doesn't really know exactly who her mother is, that's not true. He knows, but she doesn't know who her mother is. And so kind of in the style of the Mamma Mia musical, she decides to track down the 3 women that her dad had pined after to try to see if she can discover who is her true mother and who in return that means who she is. So that's called When You Get the Chance. If you are a musical lover, if you love Mamma Mia, you definitely will enjoy the journey of Millie and her tracing her father's steps. This next one is definitely on the creepy side. It's called Small Town Monsters, and this is about a girl named Vera, and there are strange things that have been happening in her town, and her parents have kind of grabbed onto this opportunity as they see it, and declare themselves demon hunters, that they can help possessed people in their town slay demons, and they basically put them in their basement. So there's all these really creepy things happening at her house. Her house has kind of become that house that other kids get dared to go up and ring the doorbell. And she ends up getting asked for help by a popular athlete named Max, whose mother is really starting to display some very disturbing behaviors. And he asks for Millie's help. He really wants her parents to help, but they, of course, are out of town. And Millie feels that, Vera feels that she has the capabilities to take on whatever's happening to Max's mom on her own. So it's called Small Town Monsters. Again, definitely on the creepy side. Don't read that one with the lights out. This next one is called The Great Destroyers, and this is actually an alternative history in which there are no nuclear weapons. None of that has been discovered. But it takes place during the Cold War, and the only weapon that is available are what they call mecha soldiers, which are those giant robotic soldiers that are controlled by a human pilot. I think we've seen a couple movies with soldiers like that. And this is a story about a girl named Jo who is really trying to break into this male-dominated field of pilots who control the mecha. And they actually have something called, I want to say it's called the PAX Games, in which they fight these robots for fun. So it's not always just about war and protecting each other, but they also have, like, you know, this sporting event where these big soldiers fight. And she wants to be a pilot and is hoping to change how pilots are viewed, and hopefully being one of the first female pilots of one of these giant soldiers. So that's called The Great Destroyers. If you like sci-fi tech, robot-y type things, you'll enjoy that. This next one is called Daughter of the Deep. It is by Rick Riordan, who is the author of The Lightning Thief. And this is about Anya, and she is 14 years old, and she currently goes to a very elite school that's all about marine ecology and diving down deep in the ocean. And she's just about to start her freshman year trials so that she can move on to the next level. Unfortunately, just as they're about to begin, their ship gets attacked by a rival school called the Land Institute, and they are interested in getting their hands on a very high-tech piece of equipment called the Nautilus, which is actually Anna's great-grandfather's ship. Captain Nemo was his name. And her parents had actually died when they couldn't control the power of the Nautilus. And now her and her friends are kind of stranded on this island when they discover the Nautilus and realize that they're going to have to keep it out of the Land Institute's hands. So all of this action takes place in the ocean. So that's called Daughter of the Deep. The Night Silver Promise takes place in a kingdom where dragons have been outlawed, and everyone has their path predetermined for them based on a constellation tattoo on their wrist. And the girl in the story, her name is Paisley. She's very anxious to find out what her fate will be when it's determined that she'll actually die before she turns 14, and she's currently 13 years old. Well, she kind of hides this from her younger brother, who it turns out is dragon touched, and is now kind of on the run from the powers that be, worried that his dragon powers will come out and destroy their carefully put together kingdom. And then their mother ends up disappearing because she discovered that fates can be altered, and then she disappeared. And now Paisley and her brother are trying to find out what happened to their mom in the hopes that they can stop Paisley's fate and keep her alive longer than just for a few more months. So it's called The Night Silver Promise. Sunny G's series of rash decisions is about a young man named Sunny whose brother had died a year before from alcohol poisoning, and he left Sunny his journal, and Sunny has decided that he's going to fill it with a series of rash decisions. And he starts by cutting off his hair and his beard, which is a very important part of their faith. And on the night of his brother's, it's called his Barsi, which is the anniversary of his death, when he should be celebrating with his family, he decides to go to prom instead. Well, his best friend convinces a young lady named Mindy to convince Sunny to go instead to a cosplay convention that is going to be celebrating his favorite comic. And she does this by stealing his brother's journal and filling it with her own rash decisions. And what sets off is a madcap night of interesting adventures. So that's called Sunny G's series of rash decisions. And And then the last fiction one I'm going to talk about today is called I Must Betray You. And this focuses on a little known part of history. It takes place in 1989 in Bucharest, Romania, which you've probably heard of before because the Black Widow talks about it a lot in the Marvel movies. But this is about a boy named Christian whose family is living in a communist-controlled country of Romania. And the two dictators, the husband and wife, are very cruel to its people. Their people are starving, they're poor, they don't have a lot of choices, and Christian kind of copes with this by writing in his journal that he hides. Well, unfortunately, the secret police figure out what he's doing, and they use it as blackmail to get him to talk about and to spy on a U.S. diplomat's son that he has become friendly with. And this is when Christian just says, I don't really want to betray my family and this boy. I'm going to see if I can be a rebel instead. And this is his story, all based on true events. All right, let's look at some graphic novels. This first one is called Penultimate Quest. This is a really good read-alike for those of you who might like Dungeons and Dragons, or if you like video games that send you on quests and you have to continually power up, level up in order to defeat the final bad guy. And this takes place on an island surrounded by sea monsters where these questers go to try to get to the underground dungeons, to the final battle below, except nobody ever gets there and nobody ever is able, or if they get down there, they never come back to tell the tale. And they realize that every day they're just kind of starting over, and it's always the next quest, but never the final quest. And until one intrepid quester says, wait, why are we doing this? Does anyone start to question what's happening on this island? It's called Penultimate Quest. Cleopatra in Space is a fun telling of what Cleopatra, the real Cleopatra, might have been like if she had been sent off into space, where she discovers a prophecy that she is going to be the one to save the galaxy. And in order to do so, she needs to go to school first and gain some leadership skills, as well as the ability to meet with other aliens, speak their languages, and determine how to best get the bad guys to disappear so that she can lead them to a victorious peace. So it's called Cleopatra in Space. This is the first in the series. There's several others. A Spark Within the Forge is actually a prequel to Saba Tahir's An Ember in the Ashes series. It's okay if you haven't read those. I did bring, we do have that at the library if you're interested in reading the book, but this is actually kind of a prequel to that series in which Laia and Danon are living a life in a very military-controlled community. They live with their nan and their pop, and Laia is kind of, she likes to stay close to home. She's very worried about going out into the community, whereas Danon is like, no, I'm going to explore, I'm gonna go figure things out. And then a disease hits their community that forces Laia to kind of move out of her comfort zone. And meanwhile, Danon is meeting up with a swordsmith named Spiro and trying to figure out a way to maybe bring peace to their community and remove some of the military might. So that's called A Spark Within the Forge. Adventure Kingdom is a story about a boy named Clark who is a wannabe streamer, and he decides to sneak into Adventure Kingdom, which was a adventure park that he really enjoyed as a child. And he meets there a young girl named Caroline, who is the granddaughter of the creator, and they discover that the magic that kind of made the kingdom so wonderful was not actually imaginary. And with the help of a talking monkey with questionable loyalties and a magic coin, they decide to track down the mystery of the Adventure Kingdom. Wingbearer is another sci-fi fantasy adventure about a girl named Zuli who for her whole life has lived with these magical bird spirits in a great tree in the middle of the forest. And she is very happy there, hasn't ever really truly questioned where she came from until a very scary witch queen decides to suck the power out of the forest and the trees. And Zuli has to come down below where she meets up with an ancient dragon to really discover who she truly is in order to save her community. So it's called Wingbearer. Definitely a dragon story if you like dragons. This next one is a part of the Japanese manga series, so it's written backwards to front. It's called Keep Your Hands Off Izukan, I'm gonna say. And this is about a group of 3 girls who really want to create their own anime. And it's a Midori who likes to design worlds, I'm gonna say Subami, who is really into animation, and then Sayaka, who is really more about making money. And the 3 of them decide that they're going to make their own science fiction fantasy anime for their student classmates to enjoy. This is the first in the series. This next one is called COVID Chronicles, and this is a collection of 60 short comics that have been donated by comic artists from all over that want to kind of talk about what it was like during the shutdown of COVID and what people are still dealing with. It looks at it from all different angles, all different ethnicities, all different situations, and they're just individual stories about that time. And all of these comics have been donated, and the money that gets raised will go towards booksellers and comic sellers that have been affected by the pandemic. So it's called COVID Chronicles. And then the last graphic novel I'm going to talk about today is called Junk Wraith, and this book focuses on the idea that anything that we've owned, that we've truly loved, if it gets thrown away and becomes junk, it releases this big burst of energy. And the girl in this story, her name is Florence, and she is an ice skater, and one day she gets really fed up with the sport and throws her ice skates away, not realizing that she's released this huge amount of energy that has turned into a terrifying spirit called a junk wraith. And what happens is these spirits attack the memories of the person who threw it away. And so now she has to go and track them down and try to resolve the anger that this event has caused her, and hopefully reconcile before it destroys everything about her. So it's called Junk Wraith. Kind of gives you a new thoughts about, oh, do we just toss our stuff? These next ones are all nonfiction. This first one is called Close Up on War, and this is about Catherine Leroy, who is a photojournalist. It takes place in 1966 when she actually went into Vietnam. She was the only woman photographer during that time, and she spent years with the soldiers in Vietnam taking photographs, and so this book is filled with her photographs, but it also talks about her experiences and the soldiers' experiences. At one point she is injured, at one point she gets captured by the enemy. If you're interested in the Vietnam War at all, or if you really like the idea of being a photojournalist, this would be an excellent read for you. So it's called Close Up on War. This next one takes place during World War II. It's called Spearhead, and it follows Clarence Smoyer, who is part of the 3rd Armored Division, which is a tank unit, and it talks about how these soldiers came together to really become a family during the war. They were one of the most difficult divisions to beat, and it talks about their experiences during World War II. Definitely some heartbreak in here, so be prepared for that. But then it also looks at the German side of the war through the eyes of Gustav Schaefer, who was also a tank gunner in the German army. So it's called Spearhead. This next one is called In Harm's Way, and it is the sinking of the USS Indianapolis and the story of its survivors. If you're not familiar with that story, it took place July 30th, 1945. The USS Indianapolis was torpedoed in the South Pacific by a Japanese submarine, and 300 men were killed instantly. 900 other soldiers were thrown into the water, where they basically had to try to survive for 4 days and nights. And when they were eventually found, only 317 remained. And this is their story. Now, the captain of the ship was actually ended up being court-martialed, but the big question is, why did the U.S. Army not know that this had happened to the Indianapolis, and why were these soldiers left to their own devices for so long? Okay, so it's called In Harm's Way. This next one is called Rolling Warrior, and it's the incredible, sometimes awkward, true story of a rebel girl on wheels who helped spark a revolution. And this is by Judith Heumann, and she was in a wheelchair at a very young age, and this talks about the difficulties she had just being recognized as a person. She was denied the right to go to school at 5 years old. Her wheelchair was determined to be a fire hazard. The New York City denied her a teaching license just because of her disability, and so she's really had to fight her entire life to just be treated as a human being. And at one point, she led over 150 other disabled people to the longest sit-in in U.S. history at the San Francisco government building in order to get rights for people like herself. So it's called Rolling Warrior. Cram, this book, is a book that talks about all the things that are happening in the world, or everything that's kind of led up to some of the troubles that we are having. There's different chapters in the book. One is isms and phobias, one is about wars, one section is about movements, and one's about disaster, and how all of these things kind of have brought us to our present situation. I always kind of enjoy books like this because I feel like there's so much news out there. It's hard to know everything that's going on, and this gives you kind of a snapshot of all the controversies that have been happening and what you should know about each, so that when you're hearing different news stories, you might be a little bit more knowledgeable about what led up to that conflict. So it's called Cram, this book. Sisters of the War is a story about Syria. In 2011, their revolution turned into a civil war, and this book follows two different sets of sisters, one set who lives in the rebel occupied territory and one set that lives in the Syrian-controlled territory, and how those lives intersect and what it's like growing up in a war-torn country. It's called Sisters of the War. There's a lot of war books that have come out recently. This next one is definitely on the creepy side. This is called Living Ghosts and Mischievous Monsters. There's 32 short stories in here told from American Indian folklore. There's a chapter on ghosts, spirits, witches, and monsters. So each one of these stories talks about something spooky from that culture, definitely on the scary side, and some of the illustrations alone are enough to give you nightmares. So if you just like scary stories, you probably will enjoy this. And then the last nonfiction I'm going to talk about might also be considered a horror story. This one is called Very, Very, Very Dreadful. And this looks at the influenza pandemic of 1918. So when flu struck came, it was a horrible pandemic. Many lives were lost. In Boston alone, in the first 2 months, they lost over 4,000 people to the pandemic. And this talks about what the world did and how they coped with it, the development of vaccines or not vaccines, where they thought it started, which honestly they didn't know for a very, very long time. It was also taking place right around World War I, and they blamed the Germans for unleashing it on the Americans. And it just looks at the pandemic from all different sides, and a lot of it you can relate to the COVID-19 pandemic as well. So if you're interested in disease history, this would be a good place to start. Hope you find something to enjoy.